Just as I was coming out of the shower, my cell phone rang. Cursing, I wrapped a towel around myself and hurried to the bedroom to grab it from the dresser. Darlene had already left for Christmas shopping at the last minute, and we planned to meet later at the consultant's office. Before I could say, hello, a cheerful male voice said, "Hi Darlene, is there a chance we can meet today for a quickie? I just can't wait another 2 days." "What on earth are you talking about?" I said angrily. There was a hesitant sigh, then 2 or 3 seconds of complete silence, followed by the click of disconnection. Stunned, I looked at the phone. What was that? Damn it. After a minute, I realized it was Darlene's phone, not mine. They were the same model, but mine had a crack on the screen that was missing from the one I was holding. She must have grabbed the wrong phone on her way to the door. But who could possibly be calling her for a sex rendezvous? Jesus Christ, was she having an affair? It looked exactly like that. Dazed, I hung up, returned to the bathroom and dried off, my mind racing. All I could think was, this can't be happening. We've been married with Darlene for 6 years. By mutual agreement, we don't have children, and the past few months have been quite tough. We were still getting along, and she still loved me, of course, but her interest in sex had practically disappeared. From 2 or 3 times a week, occasionally, at most, initiated by her, we dwindled down to once or twice a month, and even then only at my insistence. And when we did have sex, she was passive and unenthusiastic, not the passionate and excited partner she was at the beginning of our marriage. We talked about the issue again and again. Darlene kept telling me that it wasn't anything special, she was just tired, overly busy at work, blah blah blah. Except nothing had changed at her job. No major projects, no terrible deadlines, no promotions. Every time I brought it up, Darlene would say she felt better, and sometimes that night we would make love, but it always went back to the same. I ask, she declines. By the end of September, I had had enough, and one evening after dinner I sat her down on the couch. "Darlene, I love you, but I'm not willing to continue like this. I don't want to spend the rest of my life without sex. You used to enjoy having sex with me, and now, obviously, you don't anymore. Something has to change, or I'll file for divorce." She looked at me, completely stunned. "Divorce? My goodness, darling, isn't that too radical? Darlene, do you realize how bad this is?" I decided to count. In the past 3 months, we had sex 3 times, plus 1 lovemaking session. That's only 4 times since early July, and during this time, you've turned me down 18 times. I'm not going to live like this anymore. She looked down, obviously feeling very uncomfortable. "Baby, I'm sorry. You know I love you. And I can do better, I will. I promise. I'm just so tired." "That's not enough, Darlene. I want 2 promises from you, or I'll see a lawyer on Monday." She looked at me cautiously, and I continued. "Firstly, I want you to meet with Dr. Evans and undergo a full examination to make sure there are no physical issues. And secondly, I want us to start seeing a marriage counselor." "A marriage counselor? But we haven't had anything bad happen between us." This translation captures the essence of the conversation between the 2 individuals discussing their marital issues and the potential need for divorce. It's not true. Are you hearing me, Darlene? We're living together practically like brother and sister. Whether you want to admit it or not, something has really gone wrong, and we either try to fix it or I'm out. There was a long pause, filled with tears from Darlene, but I was adamant, and in the end, I got my way. She met with Dr. Evans, who confirmed her full health, and we started meeting once a week with Eileen Archer, a consultant recommended by our friends Brad and Ellison, who had worked with her parents years ago. We consulted for about 2 months, and everything seemed to be going well, or at least I thought so. We talked a lot about our relationship, about each of our jobs, about the families we came from, and about what our parents' marriages were like. Some of it seemed boring or irrelevant, but Eileen was confident that we were making progress, although life in our bedroom didn't improve from it. Up until that point, we talked less about sex and more about relationships and how we got out of bed. Eileen's motto for me was, be patient, and for both of us, be honest, with yourself and your partner. Now, standing in the bedroom, staring at Darlene's phone as if a snake had crawled out of it, I had to wonder. Had I just discovered the real reason she no longer wanted to have sex with me? It was so simple. Was I being replaced? Was someone else stepping in and playing the role of the traditional man? As far as I could tell, Darlene's schedule hadn't changed. She no longer worked late, didn't go on mysterious shopping trips or rendezvous with The girls didn't come home looking disheveled and didn't rush into the shower. But that didn't mean she wasn't sleeping with someone else. She was just being cautious about it. I picked up her phone and checked the received calls, and to my surprise, there was only one call, the one I had just answered. The caller was identified as CM. I pressed answer and waited for the tones. Surprisingly, the caller didn't dare to pick up, and the call was transferred to voicemail. "This is Chris Mason. Leave a message and I'll call you back. Have a good day." I hung up the phone. I learned the name. He was another colleague at the brokerage firm where Darlene worked, but in a different department. She mentioned him to me once or twice, but I had never met him. I checked Darlene's phone more carefully. Not only were all previous received calls deleted, but also lists of missed and outgoing calls. Who would bother spending time deleting all of this? Darlene clearly covered her tracks. I headed to the office, searching for records of calls made on the mobile and home phones over the past few months. Darlene paid the bills, so I never had a reason to look for them. On the desk, I found all the bills for our home phone, but the search revealed no calls from Chris Mason, or, at least, from his cell phone. However, records of cell phone calls for the past 8 months were missing. I checked the checkbook. All payments for the mobile phone were made, so Darlene must have hidden or disposed of the receipts, undoubtedly because they would show calls to Chris Mason. I arrived at Eileen's office 20 minutes early. Darlene's car wasn't in the parking lot yet, so I sat and pondered a bit. If I was right, if Darlene was cheating on me with Chris Mason or someone else, our marriage was over. She might love me, but that's worth nothing if she's spreading her legs for someone else. I suppose she did love me, otherwise why would she want to stay together? Why bother with seeing a counselor, besides possibly lying to both the counselor and me? But if she thought she could have her cake and, well, she's going to find out she's completely wrong. Initially, I thought to meet with Darlene today in Eileen's office, share the content of the call from Chris and demand explanations. But I realized that wasn't enough for me. I wanted evidence, and then I wanted to dramatically end our marriage, shaking Darlene to the core. I was angry and hurt, and she had to pay for what she did to me. And I had a much better place in mind for our final showdown than Eileen's office. So I went inside, and after a while, Darlene appeared, kissed me, and we went to the meeting. Eileen made us talk about the usual stuff, about how we handled our relationship with arguments, and whether there was a difference in styles based on our experience with how our parents argued, and so on. I teased, looked pensive and serious, tried to give plausible answers, and refrained from grinding my teeth too hard. Damn nuisance. I wanted to grab her by the throat and choke her right in front of Eileen. Towards the end of the session, Eileen gave me a chance to come up with one good excuse, even if it was just a slight one. She said something like, "I know this is difficult for both of you. But gradually, we're learning about your marriage, about each of your expectations towards it, and your honesty actually contributes to creating an atmosphere where we can transition the conversation from general to productive discussions, including your sexual issues." I jumped in to say, "Thank you for saying that, Eileen. Sometimes it's been hard for me, but I've tried to be absolutely honest and open. It seems like the only way to achieve anything." Darlene, could you say the same applies to you as well? I watched her as she blushed slightly and avoided my eyes. Instead, she looked at Eileen, nodded, and said, "Absolutely, Alan, I feel the same way." I wondered if Eileen noticed Darlene's obvious discomfort. She didn't comment on it, but it seemed to me that she looked closely at Darlene for a moment or two. After the session, we crossed the street to a diner to grab a quick lunch. When she went to the ladies' room, I quickly took out my mobile phone from her purse and put it in my pocket. Then I stepped outside to buy a newspaper from the vending machine and, while there, turned off Darlene's phone, wrapped it in the newspaper, and shoved it into the bottom of a trash bin. I figured Chris Mason would be desperately trying to reach Darlene to inform her of what happened, so I was determined to make sure he had no chance of getting through to her. During lunch, Darlene and I chatted about nothing in particular. Mostly about her shopping and what gifts we still needed for the next day when we were going to her parents' house for Christmas dinner. We made a list of what we needed and then headed to a row of crowded stores to buy the last few items. I was amazed at my ability to keep my cool, pretend to be pleasant when all I wanted was to lash out at her. But either I was a better actor than I thought or Darlene was too distracted, because she didn't notice that something was off. During dinner at home, the landline phone rang 3 times, and each time I jumped up to answer it. The first 2 calls were just silence. The third time, about 20 minutes later, a female voice I had never heard before asked, "Can I speak to Darlene, please?" I wondered if Chris, in desperation, had hired someone to pass on a message from him to Darlene, so I asked, "May I know who's calling?" The voice replied, Iris, from work." Smirking to myself, I said, "And what's this regarding?" She was caught off guard. There was a brief silence, and then she said, There's an account we both work on, and I have a couple of questions about it." "On Christmas Eve?" I said. "I'm afraid she can't come to the phone right now, but I'll make sure to pass on the message. Have a good evening," and I hung up with a smile. Darlene looked at me questioningly when I returned, and I said, "Some lady is conducting a survey. Can you believe them calling on Christmas Eve?" I could tell that Darlene was slightly concerned. She waited for a few minutes, then casually walked into another room, undoubtedly checking her mobile phone. She came back with her purse and looked worried. "Darling, do you know where my mobile phone could be? I remember taking it from the dresser when I left this morning." "Well, Darlene, I have no idea. Isn't it in your purse? Have you checked near your car? Or perhaps you left it somewhere in the shopping center?" She went to search the car, but to no avail, while I sat there and smiled. Eventually, she gave up, and I promised to get her a new one as a New Year's gift. "Don't count on it, dear," I thought to myself. I was sure her next move would be to try calling Chris if she could get rid of me for a few minutes. Several times during the evening, I noticed Darlene watching me out of the corner of her eye. I wondered if she was hoping to get a chance to reach the phone. Finally, she said, "Darling, I'm a bit tired. I'll go upstairs and just watch some TV for a while, okay?" "Of course, Darlene," I replied. "That actually sounds great. I'll just put the dishes in the sink and we'll go together." She smiled at me, but I could tell she was irritated. An hour later, she asked me to check that there were no garbage bins on the curb. When I reminded her that tomorrow was Christmas and there wouldn't be a pickup, she turned away from me with clear disappointment. When we went to bed, she didn't have a chance to call anyone. On Christmas morning, I woke up early, had breakfast while Darlene slept, and made a few preparations. Then I entered the bedroom and gently woke her up. "Good morning, dear. Merry Christmas," I smiled falsely at her. "There's coffee ready in the kitchen. I'm leaving. See you later at your parents' house." She clumsily sat up. "It's only 8:30, Alan. Where are you going?" I smiled again. "I need to pick up a last-minute gift for you, dear. But don't worry, we'll see each other there at 2. She protested, saying that weren't all the stores closed today, and couldn't I just come back home later and pick her up? But I was already heading towards the door, sending her an airy kiss. At 8:45, I knocked on Chris Mason's apartment door, having found his address in Darlene's work directory. I was counting on him being in town today since he had mentioned looking forward to meeting Darlene the next day. When he opened the door, he was dressed in a robe and looked sleepy. A tall, decent-looking guy, around 25 or so. Yes, what the hell? He stopped talking and stepped back into his living room, and I entered and quickly closed the door behind me. I held a Hammerly 208 pneumatic pistol in my hand, aimed straight at his chest. It wasn't a particularly lethal weapon, just something I used for close-range practice, but Mason clearly didn't know that. He looked absolutely terrified. "Allow me to introduce myself, Chris. I'm Alan Rohatton, Darlene's husband, your current lover." His eyes widened, and he took another step back. "Hey, buddy, calm down, okay? I don't know what you..." "Cut the crap, Chris. Yesterday, you called asking for sex. Do you really think I can't figure out what's going on? Here's what's going to happen now. We're going to sit here, in your living room, and have a nice chat. If I don't get the answers I need, I'll shoot you once or twice and let you bleed out. If you decide to be more cooperative, then after a while, we'll visit some acquaintances of mine and talk to them, and then I'll let you live your life. Got it?" He looked at me cautiously, nodding slightly. "All I have to do is talk to you?" I nodded. "Yeah, and I'll leave you alone. Damn shame if you get shot, isn't it?" Chris and I chatted for a bit, and he told me everything I wanted to know. Then I kept an eye on him as he got dressed and took his clothes to the bathroom to shower and dress. After that, he made sandwiches for us in his kitchen, and we ate while I kept the gun aimed at him the whole time. We didn't talk much, but it was fine by me. At 1:45, we got out and got into my car. I gave Chris the address and told him to drive while I sat in the back seat with the gun in my hand. When we reached Darlene's parents' house, I ordered Chris to park 4 houses down so they couldn't see my car. I noticed Darlin's car was already there, along with her sister Barbara's car and her husband's. But I wanted to make an impressive entrance, so we waited until 2:30 before I pulled Chris out of the car and escorted him to their driveway. Now no games, understood, Chris? I asked. You remember the deal? We go in, I make a few opening remarks, you tell your story, and I leave. And you save your life. My gun will be in my pocket, but it will appear in less than a second if you pull any crap on me. He looked somewhere between uneasy and sheer terror. Don't worry, dude, I'll play along just like you said. When we rang the doorbell, Darlin's mom, Sarah, answered. Her welcoming smile turned into a puzzled one when she saw Chris. Hi, Alan, who is this? Hello, Sarah, Merry Christmas, I said, kissing her on the cheek as we entered the foyer. This is Chris, he's just here for a few minutes. Ignoring her confusion, I took Chris by the hand and led him straight to the dining room where the family was just about to start snacking. Apparently, they were about to begin without me. Merry Christmas, everyone, I said with a joyful smile, looking at their surprised faces. There sat Darlin's father, Tom, and her sister Barbara with her husband Mark and their 2 boys, Teddy and Ben. And then there was Darlin. The others all had a puzzled but pleasant, even anticipatory expression on their faces. What a pleasant surprise, they thought, an additional guest. But Darlin looked as pale as a ghost. Her mouth opened a couple of centimeters, and I thought she might faint. Attention, everyone, this is Chris. He's Darlin's colleague, and he has a little story to tell us. Go ahead, Chris. Darlin stood up. No, Alan, this isn't. I quickly cut her off. It's okay, Darlin, I think everyone should hear this. She took a few quick steps toward the door, but I grabbed her hand and held her tightly. Come on, Chris. Darlin tried to break free from me, saying, No, Chris, don't. I put my free hand over her mouth to silence her while her parents looked on in complete astonishment. Chris reluctantly began to speak. Darlin and I had an affair. It started in April and has been going on until now. Darlin's family gasped, then stared at Chris, then at Darlin and me. After a long pause, Barbara lifted Teddy and Ben from their chairs and ushered them into the living room, where she turned on the television, then came back and closed the door behind her. Carry on, Chris, I smiled. We met at work. There are several massage rooms in the fitness center with lockable doors. We do this about twice a week, meeting at different times, so no one noticed a pattern. We work on different floors of the building, so no one realized we were leaving at the same time. There are shower stalls there where we freshen up afterward. Darlin continued to struggle with me. She tried to bite my hand, but I held her firmly. And, Chris, I said, what exactly were you 2 doing together? Please, be specific. He didn't meet my eyes. We, mostly, have sex. I enjoyed seeing the horror on Darlin's mother's face. Darlin stopped struggling with me, and I removed my hand from her mouth. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face. And what's it like sleeping with Darlin? I asked amiably. I knew what his answer would be. I had made him practice a couple of times to make sure everything went smoothly. She's very hot. Always very proactive. She flexes her thighs, pushes against me, especially when it's time for climax. She says things like, I need you with me, or, I've been thinking for 3 days about having sex with you again. To my surprise, Darlin's relatives still hadn't moved. I expected someone to try to put an end to this. She enjoys sex the most. She tries to make me climax before I can give her pleasure, but usually I win. Has she ever talked about me? I asked. Sometimes. She says she loves you but doesn't want to stop having sex with me. When were you planning to meet again? Tomorrow. She was going to tell you that she needed to work at the office. We planned to be together for about 3 hours. We were looking forward to having more time this time. She said she was going to have sex in a way that would make my eyes pop out, that she would tire me out so much that I wouldn't even be able to walk. And how long do you think this affair will last? He said, probably a few more weeks. I would be happy to continue, but Darlin said it's time to stop. She said you insisted on counseling because your sex life had taken a nosedive, and she was worried that you would figure out what was going on. She said New Year's Day would be the day to break up with me, but then she laughed and said it might take her a few weeks to wrap everything up. There was silence in the room as Darlin's family looked at us in shock. Me, Darlin, Chris, we all stood there. Darlin was crying, covering her face with her hands, not trying to say anything. I approached Tom, took his hand, and shook it. Goodbye, Tom. I've enjoyed being your son-in-law. You and Sarah are good people, and you deserve better as a daughter than this cheating scum. Of course, I also deserved better for myself as a wife than her. I went to Sarah, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Goodbye, Sarah. Sorry, I won't stay for lunch. It might be a bit awkward." Darlin collapsed to the floor. She was still crying, just sitting there and covering her face with her hands. I leaned in and said, "Don't come home tonight, Darlin. Your things will be packed outside the garage by tomorrow morning, and I'll change the locks. And I repeat, don't try to talk to me. There's nothing you can say that I want to hear." She looked at me, streaks of running mascara crossing her face. "Alan, dear, I said, no." Without saying another word, I turned to the table, smiled, waved to everyone, and headed for the door. Chris had the sense not to ask me for a ride home.